Okay, so this is my presentation about SQLite for SDV602 Project Milestone 2. We're just going to do a bit of a brief overview about SQLite, which is the local database management system that we're using in our application builds in Unity. Okay, so what is SQLite? Essentially, SQLite is a relational database management system that's contained in a really tiny C# C programming library. It it's really compact. It still actually meets the requirements of the SQL 92 standard. And in fact, it's actually one of the most widely used database engines in the world. It's built into so many little devices and comes in bundled with all these applications because it's such a lightweight little database, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Its source code is in the public domain. It's free. It's available to anybody, and SQLite claims that they have over 1 trillion SQLite databases in active use, which is a huge amount. So a little bit about the history. It was SQLite was designed in 2000 by a chap called Dwayne Richard Hepp, or D. Richard Hepp. At the time, he was a self-employed software contractor who was doing a bit of work on a project for General Dynamics, and it was a contract from the US Navy. I think it was something to do with destroyers and radar and stuff like that. Anyway, basically, it wasn't working out for him that well. He was having issues with the database and the application that he was actually working on. He wasn't even working on anything to do with a database at the time. But yeah, essentially, he ended up building his own database to basically facilitate what he was trying to do. He based it essentially off the language and structure of PostgreSQL, which is, again, that's a free open source object related database management system. And yeah, so he built this really lightweight database system, and he released it himself on his own website or what have you, as he was known to do. He did a little bit of software development and such. And yeah, he was very surprised when it actually just totally took off, really blew up and blew out of the water. Basically, there's been a huge amount of releases and versions of SQLite in the last 19 years. You can see 302 releases over 19 years, which is about 15 releases a year I worked out, which is pretty impressive. But it did kind of go through three big iterations, each one SQLite 1.0, SQLite 2.0, and SQLite 3.0. Each of those versions marks like sort of big milestones and improvements on the engine. Okay, so why would you use it? What are the advantages of using SQLite? Because it's public domain and open source, you don't need a license to work with it. It's free. You can do whatever you want with it. Anybody can use it. So, I mean, straight away there's savings and flexibility there. SQLite does not use the sort of classic client server data architecture. It exists on the device, so it's serverless. It comes with the application. Perhaps the application actually creates the database. So yeah, we don't need to communicate with something in the back end that's going to hold our data, essentially. It's designed to be really quick and easy to spin up, so zero configuration is required when you're installing it. And they're really, really proud of it. They support it. They basically have a full-time team of developers from all over the world, and these developers, their job is literally to just continue to maintain and expand SQLite, and they basically have a pledge that they are going to fully support it until 2050. So you can have a little bit of confidence in that. It's quite a nice situation. Also, SQLite is a cross-platform database management system that is supported by a wide range of different operating systems. And also, we've got 2 pages of advantages because it's a pretty cool thing. Yep, it's very compact. It's lightweight. The database file, often it's just a single one, is actually can be 16 KB. They test it a lot. They use 3 different, essentially, they called them test harnesses. I hadn't heard that term, but essentially 3 testing frameworks, and they just absolutely hammer it with transactions and under all sorts of situations. And a really cool thing is that even though SQLite is really light and is really compact and doesn't have all of the stuff that you would find in some of the bigger, more full-on database management systems, it does actually still support ACID, autonomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability. Even in the event where there was a power failure or a system crash, essentially data would either be saved to the system or it would not be saved at all. There would be no chance of any data corruption in those sort of failure situations. Another cool feature of it is that the little fields, the tuples, are actually dynamic. So while you can give them a value, if you put in a value that is less than the value you've specified when you created your table, it will actually dynamically shrink to fit whatever you put in there. So there's no kind of wasted space there. You're not reserving memory that's not being used because it just will, if there's nothing there, it'll just adjust what it's doing. Okay, some of the disadvantages, there's not heaps, to be honest. And most of them basically have to do with if you try to do things with SQLite that it's not designed to do, it's not going to work that well. So, for example, it's light, it's small, so the databases are often can't get any bigger than 2 gigabits. They can, but I believe you actually start to lose quite a bit of efficiency when you kind of scale it up to that, next level. And in fact, I think even on the SQLite website, they basically recommend if you're going beyond a certain point, actually it's time to change your platform and change to an actual server-based big sort of database management system. Okay. Anyway, I digress. Some of the other things that you may have issues with SQLite is this interesting thing where multiple processes can access and query the database at the same time, but only one process can actually write at a time. So essentially, that table will be locked until that process is finished making its change and committing it, and then the table will unlock, and then another process can jump in and make changes to the database. So, I mean, which is great in terms of database integrity, but not necessarily so good in terms of database concurrency or lots of people being able to access the database and make changes simultaneously. Because SQLite is serverless, it's a little bit less secure than if we did actually have a database on a server side and we have kind of all these points between our, we've got ports, we've got firewalls, we've got various layers of additional security and protection, and we can build in degrees of validation and processes and stuff while we're moving the data between these two physically separate devices. But we don't have that with SQLite. And I do know when I was working on my app that there were a few times where I thought, wow, I should actually probably do a bit of research if I ever had time on just some sort of best practices with data security and validation, because it does feel quite wide open that and in fact I'll come to another little point about that. An interesting thing about SQLite, and it's hard to say whether this is an advantage or a disadvantage. Perhaps it's both, perhaps it's neither. But SQLite, when you make a database, you can specify the data type that are going to be on your tuples, and you can specify that integers, char, strings, whatever you actually want. It pretty much supports most of the data types. But the interesting thing is, while you can do that, SQLite does not enforce that. So it would prefer that if you said, okay, this tuple is going to take integer, that you put an integer into that. But if you put a char or a string into that, it would actually accept it, which is it's a sort of interesting concept. It's really interesting in terms of the kind of flexibility that could allow you, but also not so good in terms of the potential for your database to be corrupted with dirty data going in. So, yeah, it's one of those ones. It's a pro and a con. I couldn't totally tell you which it would be. Also, another little disadvantage of SQLite is that you can't directly hook it up to the network. So you can't sort of have your app and have SQLite and have SQLite talking directly to a backend database. You're actually going to have to move your data through from the SQLite database through your application, and then from your application to the backend server, which can be okay, but apparently it can also be quite a sort of inefficient way of handling and moving your data. Okay, so SQLite, as I said, multi-platform, supported by loads of, basically supported by anything, particularly like small devices. So you can see we've got iOS and Android and BlackBerry, sorry, but also, of course, Mac, Windows, Linux, iOS, all the bigger sort of databases. And on top of that, it's actually supported by loads of technologies that don't really have an OS that you would know or have heard of in terms of like more smaller devices and things like that. So where's SQLite going in the future? I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer that it's really going to, I personally, and just having a bit of a look at it, think it'll actually kind of really take off, because what SQLite excels in doing is providing a really lightweight SQL database in conjunction with an application that's all self-contained on quite a small device. You don't need a lot of computing power or a lot of memory. It's so lightweight, and so it's ideally suited for smaller devices. So really, Internet of Things is how I kind of see it taking off, because it provides a SQL database for things that are, drones, toys, household appliances, cameras, phones, obviously, and just things like that, where you don't have the room for a big, full-on database management system, but just a way to actually sort your data in a SQL database and to be able to fire queries to it and sort and pull your data and validate it for that way is really cool. So yeah, it seems very likely that it's just going to actually, it's already incredibly popular, but that it will just continue to be incredibly widely used. And because they do have that guarantee that they will support it until 2050, which is the date they've given, it's quite an attractive thing. And I did read some interesting stuff as I was researching for this about a couple of museums that actually use SQLite to store historical information and such, because they take a certain amount of comfort in the fact that it is guaranteed to be supported in 2050. So they see that as a very viable sort of long-term storage, even though it is this ultra-light little database that we can just spin up out of our applications. Anyway, I believe, yep, that basically sums up my presentation. I hope you enjoyed, and yeah, pleasure.